This is the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Architect Exam Podcast. I'm Michael Rosica. It finally happened. NCARB has officially announced the 2025 changes to the Architect Exam and the AXP program. They hosted a big webinar yesterday to announce these changes. I had been anticipating this day since 2016 when AIA 5.0 was released. And after it was over, I think I was more confused and had more unanswered questions than before the webinar. So after the webinar was over, I did a ton of research on what the changes were that NCARB didn't want to talk about at the webinar. And I just want to get this podcast out quickly with my analysis of what's actually changing before weird rumors started being shared, because that's exactly what happened when they updated the Architect Exam in 2015. But before we get started, I just have to admit that this will be my third major NCARB exam update that I've lived through. I started studying for my exams when it was changing from 9 exams to 7 exams during the update from 3.1 to 4.0 back in 2009. Then I lived through the big overhaul when it went from 7 exams to 6 exams with AIA 5.0 in 2016, and now it's changing again in 2026. So I've got some perspective on this. And I live in Florida, and I'm starting to feel like these AIA exam updates is kind of like living through a hurricane, where everyone is like, I've been through worse, this is no big deal. But honestly, I want you to know that after all the drama happened with NCARB during the pandemic, I had actually been dreading these changes for a very long time. And here they are. And after I completed my analysis, I will say I was actually expecting a lot worse, but I want to be optimistic. Understand that every time NCARB makes a change to the architect exam, it always has a massive impact. And it usually takes us about 2 years to figure out if what they did was a good idea or a bad one. But here's what you need to know right up front, is NCARB's making some housekeeping changes to AXP and the case studies, but most importantly, they're changing 12 out of 91 exam objectives. That's about 13%. NCARB has repeatedly said that this isn't going to change how you study, and all of your AIA study materials will still be relevant. But before we dive in and I explain all this stuff, I just have a quick announcement. Young Architect is hosting a gigantic Black Friday sale beginning on November 18th through December 2nd, 2025. This is going to be our biggest Black Friday sale ever. And I don't know if you knew this, but over the past year, we rebuilt our entire website and online architecture school from scratch. The Young Architect Academy now has over 120 hours of video content focused on AIA exam objectives and over 1,600 AIA practice questions. So come back to youngarchitect.com between November 18th and December 2nd to join us for a massive Black Friday fiesta. All right, let's talk about how this podcast is going to go down. First, I want to talk about the AXP changes. I'll just hit the high points. Some of these changes will actually start taking place next week on November 18th. And then I want to talk about the case studies. Let's talk about AXP and case studies first because they're quick. And then I want to discuss all the changes that are happening with the AIA objectives and dive into what these objective changes are, going exam by exam and what you need to know as you study for these tests. And then at the end, I'll give you my opinion on all this information. Let's get started.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, your guide to passing the ARE.
Hey guys, real quick. If you want detailed information about these changes to the exam objectives, just head over to youngarchitect.com/AIA Changes. That's all as one word. We put together a really detailed blog post that breaks everything down, and we even created a 2-page PDF that you can print that summarizes everything we're talking about in this episode. So again, that's youngarchitect.com/AIA Changes. So why is this happening? Well, historically, the AIA gets updated and overhauled about every 10 years. The last update happened when we went from 4.0 to 5.0 in 2016, and that was probably the biggest change the architect exam had ever seen. It completely shifted from being a subject-based divisions, like, you had a structures test, a building systems test, and a pro practice exam, to being more of like a timeline-based exam. Like PA is all about, programming and pre-design. PPD is all about the schematic design phase. PDD is all about construction docs. And CE is all about construction administration. So now they're testing us in 5.0 on different moments of time. You guys already know this. But 2025 is the 10-year anniversary of talking about changing the architect exam, and I knew this was coming. And honestly, I was actually pretty terrified of what our NCARB was going to do next with the architect exam, because I felt like it literally took 3 years before we started to properly understand how to study for PPD and PDD. And many people still haven't even figured this out. But during the last transition, NCARB sold us on PPD and PD as a huge upgrade coming from 4.0. They said, instead of taking 4.0 exams, you only have to take 2 5.0 exams. And everyone, myself included, we all cheered and celebrated this change in the name of progress. And fast forward a few years, that was actually a terrible deal. It was actually easier to study and pass 4.0 exams than it is to pass these 2 5.0 exams. And the pass rates of the architect exam dropped drastically when we switched to 5.0. So here we are 10 years later, and I was getting anxious about these upcoming architect exam changes. But it wasn't a surprise. I knew this was coming for a long time. NCARB actually started working on this back in 2023 when they did what was called the Analysis of Practice Survey with 20,000 architects. They were trying to figure out what competencies were actually needed when someone got licensed. And then they got the feedback through this really long, frustrating survey. If you took it, you know what I'm talking about. But it had these vague multiple choice questions with no room for nuance or any other options or opinions. It was on a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think it is for a licensed architect to understand quality assurance? On a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think it is for a licensed architect to understand life safety building codes? On a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think it is for a licensed architect to calculate their profit on a project? And guys, there were hundreds of these questions. It felt like it was never ending. I hated everything about this survey, but I felt like I had a moral and professional responsibility to complete the whole damn thing. In October of 2024, they finalized the survey information and released a document called the NCARB Competency Standard for Architects, which basically boiled down 20,000 survey responses to define what an AIA candidate needs to prove in 16 different categories to get their architecture license. Now, you're going to see NCARB loves talking about the competency standard because it's the justification and basis for all their decisions behind all their actions. And whether you agree with them or not, they're just doing what the profession told them that they should do through that never-ending survey from 20,000 architects. And the results from that survey are now materializing in what the changes we're seeing now. NCARB's aligning both AXP and the AIA with the competency standard they've been doing. But the good news is the competency standard isn't giving us a major overhaul of AXP or the AIA like I thought it would. It seems to be just minor adjustments. And unless something changes or NCARB gives us a big surprise, this will probably be the most minimal upgrade the AIA has seen in the past 30 years. So as I mentioned, I showed up to NCARB's webinar yesterday, 3 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, and I actually planned my whole day around attending this webinar, hoping to learn more about the changes in these objectives. But at the webinar, NCARB made it very clear they didn't want to talk about the changes to the objectives and just told everyone to just go read their blog post. So after the webinar was over, I read their blog post and did a ton of research, understanding what these changes mean for each exam. And I want to share that information with you. I think these changes are actually pretty interesting. And if you ever studied for the AIA exam, you will too. But before we get started, let's talk about the AXP changes and the changes with the case studies. Let's just get those out of the way because they're both pretty quick. And then we'll dive into talking about the architect exam. All right, so listen up. I am not an AXP expert. I did my hours a very long time ago. It's not something I follow very closely, and I just kind of pay attention to it in the background. But if you're working on AXP, I highly recommend reading NCARB's blog post on it. But I want to give you the high points so you understand what's changing. An important note, guys, these changes only apply if you still have AXP to complete. If you completed your AXP a long time ago, none of this impacts you. The changes I'm going to tell you about real quick are going to go into effect on November 18th. That's next week. And there's 3 major changes happening. The first one, and this sounds more confusing than I think it is they're moving away from the 96 tasks for AXP to more of a competency-based descriptions. So there's the 6 experience areas are still staying the same. That's not changing. But instead of having 99 different tasks, they're moving to this competency-based descriptions that align with the competency standard. It sounds to me like they're going to make it easier for you to define the work you did in the office and then align it back to tracking your AXP. The competencies are more flexible and less prescriptive. It should also be easier for your supervisor to understand and review your experience. NCARB said their interface is going to look identical. However, when you hover over the experience titles, you'll see a different pop-up with the competencies. NCARB repeatedly stressed for people that are working on an AXP portfolio method they'll still use the 96 tasks. So this change with the competencies in AXP is only for the people who are hourly reporting. And then all of your AXP data is going to be reorganized and transitioned over into a new AXP system on November 18th. Yep, they said it, guys. They used that dirty word, transition. If you didn't already know this, that during the pandemic, we learned that anytime NCARB uses the word transition, it means you should worry. And anytime NCARB tells you not to worry about something, it means you should probably worry about it. So here's my recommendation for all my friends who are still tracking their AXP hours. Before November 18th, just log into my NCARB and take a screenshot of what your AXP hours look like. Hopefully, I'm just being silly and you'll never need that information. But guys, NCARB shortchanged me 500 hours when I was going through this process. And it took me a really long time to get it fixed. And the only thing that saved me was I had records of what my hours should have been, and I was able to prove that they made a mistake. So just go take a few screenshots of what your AXP record looks like before this transition happens. That's all. All right, the second AXP change is they're changing the reporting policy. So the current policy says if you report your hours within 8 months, you'll get 100% credit. And then if you report them within 5 years, you get 50% credit. And older than 5 years, you get nothing. The new policy, starting November 18th, says if you report within 12 months, you get 100% credit. And then anything older than 12 months will now get 75% credit. And there is now no longer a time limit. On November 18th, they're going to transition everyone over. So you guys might actually see more AXP credit than what you had previously. That's why I also, like I said earlier, take that screenshot. You're not going to have to resubmit any hours that were previously submitted, but they said, if you were holding off on adding hours because it didn't qualify, now is, after November 18th, maybe you should submit those hours from over 5 years ago. I think this is a good announcement. I think this will be helpful for a handful of people. All right, the last AXP announcement is they expanded their continuing education opportunities. Previously, you could only use AIA CEUs for AXP credit. Now, NCARB is expanding to include courses from NCARB themselves and the Society of American Registered Architects. You can earn up to 20 hours of experience through continuing education. I highly recommend this. I think NCARB CEUs are really well done, and they've done a fantastic job with that stuff. And so I would recommend all of you look into that a little bit more and pick up those AXP hours by doing those CEUs. So much of it's applicable to the architect exam. For more details, I highly recommend reading NCARB's blog post on these AXP changes. All right, next, let's talk about case studies. Guys, NCARB's streamlining case studies, and these changes are going to go into effect on April 27th. Here's what's changing. Each case study is going to have fewer resources, fewer documents to sort through and click through on each case study. Each individual case study is now going to have fewer questions. But here's the important part is that the total number of case study questions per division actually stays the same. So you're going to get more case studies, less documents per division. So instead of like 2 really long, chunky case studies with tons of PDFs to look at, you're going to get 3 or 4 shorter ones that apparently will be more streamlined. NCARB claims this will reduce exam loading times, less time spent reviewing case study resources during the exam, and provide more efficient testing experience. Their user interface will be exactly the same navigation, same everything, just fewer resources and items per case study. NCARB claims this is a quality of life improvement and sold this as a huge benefit to you. And like I said earlier, you got to wait and see. I think this is good news, but it's going to take a few years to figure out how this pans out. They also said they're going to be putting out some new practice exams reflecting some of these changes that will be released in February of 2026. And then the updated ARI guidelines are going to come out in January of 2026. All right, those are all the quick announcements. Let's get into the ARI objective changes. And this is where things start to get really interesting. All right, now that we got the NCARB housekeeping out of the way, let's get into the ARI objective changes. And this is where stuff really starts to get interesting. So these changes are going to go into effect on April 27th, 2026. If you're planning on completing all your exams before April 27th, then listen, just turn off this podcast, go get a beer, and then get back to your studying. For everyone else, listen up. Now, I mentioned earlier, NCARB didn't want to talk about the objective changes in yesterday's webinar. 30 minutes into the webinar, they basically just said 12 out of the 91 objectives are changing, 9 are minor tweaks, 3 are narrowed in scope. Just go read our blog post for more details. And then they quickly moved on. And I got pissed. I literally yelled at the computer screen. Guys, I rearranged my schedule so I could attend this webinar at 3 p.m. on a Monday. I've been waiting 8 years for this information, and NCARB doesn't want to talk about it. This is the second time this year NCARB tricked me into sitting through one of these webinars and didn't share any of the information they promised they would share, and then spent an hour answering softball questions that no one asked, clarifying information that no one was confused about. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So immediately after the webinar was over, I found their blog post and I went through all the changes and started comparing the old objectives to the new ones. And that's what I want to walk you through next. NCARB has repeatedly said these changes won't significantly affect how you prepare for these exams. Your study materials don't need to change, and not to worry. But I think you should be the one who decides that. NCARB's objectives truly define how you study for one of their exams. It's kind of the most important info that everyone needs to know. I was hoping NCARB would discuss if the objective percentages were changing, but they didn't want to talk about that, and that's still a massive unknown. Now, as an AIA prep company, the Young Architect Academy will be addressing all of these changes with fresh content and practice questions, and I'm actually excited to start working on creating this content. I also think this is the first time NCARB's objectives have ever been in the spotlight at all. I love NCARB's objectives, and I love teaching people how to make sense of them. Because once you understand how to decode what NCARB is trying to tell you, studying for the architect exam starts to become a lot clearer and so much less of a mystery. And one of the weirdest things that have always surprised me is that many AIA candidates and even prep companies just flat out ignore NCARB's objectives. And I just don't understand it. If you're not studying NCARB's objectives, you're actually not studying for the architect exam. You guys should be really careful with an AIA prep company that tells you, don't worry about NCARB's objectives. We've figured this all out for you. Just study these videos I made and you'll pass the test. Then what happens is the AIA prep company decides what they think is important, and studying for the architect exam turns into this game of telephone where you are interpreting someone else's interpretation of what NCARB actually said. If your goal is to just quickly and efficiently pass these exams, it's cheaper, easier, and faster to just study what NCARB said they will be testing you on. But honestly, if I was in your shoes, I would still study the stuff NCARB said got removed, and then I'd pay extra attention to what these changes are. Now, before we start discussing each exam, there's one last huge elephant in the room that no one's talking about, and that's 2027 AIA contracts. The AIA updates their contracts every 10 years. 1997, 2007, 2017, and guess what? 2027 is about 14 months away. And I haven't heard a peep about AIA contracts getting updated in 2027, but I assume it's coming. After reviewing all the changes in the objectives, I think NCARB might possibly be future-proofing a few of these objectives for some upcoming AIA contract changes that haven't been announced yet. But that's just a weird theory I came up with after I started to see the details of what NCARB was changing.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
All right, let's talk about these objectives. Now, I'm going to share with you a quick summary for the podcast because this is an audio podcast, and I know you're probably driving, walking the dog, or at the gym right now. So I'm going to explain these changes in basic terms and leave out all the objective numbers. But if you want more detailed information about these changes, including all my specific objective numbers, a much deeper analysis, visit the blog post for this podcast at youngarchitect.com/AIA update. We even put together a 2-page PDF that you can print out with all these changes. It will also contain links to everything I'm about to talk about, so don't feel like you need to write 1,000 things down. And lastly, as a quick disclaimer, I don't work for NCARB. I have zero insider knowledge or control over what happens on the architect exam. I'm just the average Joe concerned citizen trying to understand and interpret what NCARB is struggling to tell us. And everything I'm about to share with you is my interpretation, and you might have a different opinion, and that's cool. All right, let's break down these objective changes by each exam. All right, let's start with practice management. 3 objectives are changing here, and there's a clear pattern you need to understand. NCARB's narrowing the focus and getting more specific about what they want you to know. And the first change is all about project risk assessment. The old objective had you determining both the risk and the reward of taking on a project. You had to evaluate the upside. Why would the practice even want this project? What is in it for me? What's the opportunity? What kind of AIA design awards could the firm win by taking on this project? Guys, well, that's all gone now. The new objective is purely about understanding project risks and how to mitigate them. NCARB completely removed the rewards and opportunities from practicing architecture and replaced it with worrying more about your liabilities. NCARB wrote on their blog post that the competency standard has removed project rewards as a knowledge area for initial licensure. So this means you'll spend less time thinking about why a practice might want to take on a challenging project, the prestige, the portfolio building, entering a new market, or hell, maybe even making a profit on taking on a challenging project. I guess that's less of a priority. And now you're going to spend more time focused on how to protect the practice from various risks. Make sure you focus your PCM studying heavily on risk mitigation strategies, contract language that protects the architect, insurance types and coverage, project red flags that increase liability, and when to walk away from a project. A few months ago, Emily put out a really good podcast all about understanding an architect's insurance. Check out episode 021, Architect Insurance, the Designer's Guide to Risk Management. The second change is about business structures. The old objective had you analyzing how different practice methodologies impact the structure and organization of a practice. It was broader and more theoretical. Now it's a lot simpler. You're just identifying and comparing business structures like LLCs, S-corps, partnerships, sole proprietorships. You need to know the pros and cons of each structure: liability protection, tax implications, administrative complexity, ownership flexibility, and which structures are most common in architecture and why. Emily did another fantastic podcast on this exact topic. Check out episode 029, Business Entity Types for Architects. Save your assets. I'd also say you could probably de-emphasize studying all the evidence-based design and other practice methodologies for this specific objective. It's now just about the fundamental business entity types. And then the third PCM change is about design and documentation processes for different types of projects. So like before, instead of broadly evaluating methodologies, you're now comparing different project types that require different approaches. A residential project doesn't follow the same process as a hospital project. You need to understand those differences. How does the code requirements differ? What kind of consultants are needed? What are the review processes? What's the documentation requirements? Guys, think about residential versus commercial versus healthcare versus institutional. Each one has different coordination complexity, different consultant teams, different approval processes. I actually talked about all this stuff on the very first Architect Exam podcast, episode 001, which is called Public Works Projects versus Private Residential Projects, 12 Key Differences. I think now it's less about studying methodologies in the abstract and more about understanding how real project types demand different approaches. So to zoom out, I'd say the big picture on practice management is all three of these changes are about making things more practical and more focused. It's less theoretical and it's more applied knowledge. And there's a clear defensive shift towards risk mitigation and liability protection over assessing opportunities. So if you're studying for practice management right now, I don't think you need to throw out your studying materials, but you should definitely spend extra time on risk management, business structures, and how different project types work in practice. All right, let's talk about project management. I love project management. This one has 5 objectives changing. So buckle up. Let's break it all down. The first change is all about budget monitoring. The old objective said evaluate compliance with construction budget, which was pretty vague. The new objective makes it much more explicit. You're monitoring the project throughout its design and documentation phases for budget compliance. This is clarifying that budget tracking happens during schematic design, design development, and construction documents, not just during construction. You need to understand continuous monitoring techniques, regular cost checks as the design develops, flagging budget concerns early, value engineering, tracking scope changes and their cost impacts. And this is about being proactive about budget management during design, not being reactive after bids come in too high. The second change is about documentation for delivery methods. The old objective had you evaluating project documentation to ensure it supports the delivery method. Now you're implementing policies and procedures to document a project for a specified delivery method. So this change actually shifts from evaluating to taking action. You're setting up the documentation system, not just checking if it works. You need to know documentation requirements by every delivery method. Design bid build needs complete 100% finished CDs before bidding, whereas design build has different levels of design at handoff. And CM has phase documentation and IPD has collaborative approaches. So understand how documentation changes with the different delivery methods. Also understand what policies and procedures are needed, document naming conventions, review workflows, consultant coordination protocols, what the change document processes are. And then the last three project management changes are all about quality control processes, and NCARB split them up into very specific focuses. Now, just so you know, NCARB calls it quality control processes, and they don't get into the whole QA, QC thing. And so if they're not going to worry about it, I'm not going to worry about it right now. So the first quality control change is all about identifying the processes, the policies, and the resources for quality control and reducing risk. You need to know standard QA, QC processes like peer reviews, reviewing drawings, code reviews, coordination checks, consultant review protocols. You need to understand the policies that support quality control like standard of care, review checklists, red line procedures, sign-off protocols. You also need to be able to identify the resources like internal staff reviews, external consultants, software, code checking services. A few months ago, I posted a really good podcast all about standard of care that taps into a lot of the stuff NCARB's talking about here. It's episode 031, and it's called Standard of Care, the Fine Art of Not Screwing Up. All right, the second quality control project management change is specifically about coordination and constructability. You're now implementing quality control processes to ensure the project is coordinated and buildable. Focus on coordination, clash detection between disciplines, MEP coordination, basically coordination. And study constructability review, sequencing issues, means and methods, material availability, deadlines, buildability of the design intent, and all that stuff gets covered in this objective. And then the third PJM quality control change is all about maintaining design integrity. You're implementing systems to maintain the integrity of design objectives. You make sure your QA, QC processes are dialed in and they protect the design intent. Guys, this gets into design intent documentation, checkpoint reviews against the original objectives, value engineering reviews, substitution request review procedures, design continuity checks. Make sure you understand how the design objectives can get compromised. Budget cuts happen without proper evaluation, contractors make substitutions, owner makes changes late in the process, or how even the consultant or building codes can force revisions to happen to the design. Now, the good news is that Emily published an amazing podcast all about understand quality assurance and quality control and how to incorporate these concepts into every aspect of your project. Check out episode 013, QA versus QC. One prevents problems and the other finds them. I think this is probably one of our most popular podcasts. All right, so to zoom out, let's talk about the big picture of project management. Guys, these changes clarify when and how you're managing projects. Budget tracking is emphasized during design phases, documentation systems need to be set up properly, and quality control gets very specific about what you're checking for. If you're studying for project management, focus on budget monitoring techniques during schematic design, design development, construction docs. Understand how to set up quality control systems, not just perform quality control checks. Know specific processes for coordination, checking, and constructability reviews. All right, let's talk about programming and analysis. Guys, programming and analysis has one objective changing, but it's probably the biggest philosophical shift in these 2026 changes. And I really like this one that they made. It's all about project budgets and schedules. The old objective had you recommending a preliminary project budget and schedule. You were creating them from scratch. But the new objective has you reviewing and assessing the feasibility of the project budget and schedule that someone else has prepared. You're moving from creator to reviewer, and that's a huge difference. So instead of calculating and telling the client, this 50,000 square foot office building should cost $8 million, except now with this change, you're being given a budget by the owner who says, I got $8 million, and it's your job to evaluate and ask, can we actually build this 50,000 square foot office building for that amount? If you're studying for PA right now, don't panic. The underlying knowledge is actually still the same. You still need to understand what things cost and how long projects takes, but you're applying that knowledge differently. Focus on learning to critique and evaluate budgets rather than create them. When you study for PA, learn to identify red flags in project budgets, like a missing line item that should be there, any costs that seem too low for the scope, unrealistic timelines for the amount of work, budget numbers that don't align with the program requirements. So understand typical cost ranges for different project types and building systems so you can spot when something is off. Practice evaluating feasibility. When you see a project scenario, ask yourself, if the owner gave me this budget, would I believe I could deliver this project? You still need to understand cost factors, site conditions, materials, systems, project complexity, but instead now you're using that knowledge to evaluate rather than calculate. All right, let's talk about the big picture of PA. I think this change likely reflects how practice has been evolving for a really long time. In real life, architects are increasingly reviewing cost information prepared by contractors or cost estimators, rather than being the primary source of project cost data. This is probably just a liability protection move, which I think might be aligning with maybe some upcoming AI contract updates that may clarify the architect's role as a reviewer and an advisor on costs. If you're studying for PA, focus on developing your evaluation and critical review skills for budgets and schedules. All right, let's dive into PPD, Project Planning and Design. Project Planning and Design has two objectives changing, and they're both related to costs. The first is about evaluating cost estimates. The old objective said perform cost evaluation, pretty broad. The new objective says you're evaluating cost estimates based on the project design. Similar to the PA change, you're now evaluating estimates that have been prepared likely by cost consultants rather than creating them yourself. So focus on evaluation skills. Is this estimate reasonable for the design? Does the estimate account for these design elements? Are the cost assumptions appropriate? Do the numbers align with the level of design development? Layla's podcast on construction cost estimates covers a lot of this evaluation thinking. Check out episode 041, Construction Cost Estimates, Getting the Numbers Right. So make sure you understand what makes a cost estimate accurate or questionable. Appropriate level of detail for the design phase, inclusion of all building systems, realistic unit costs, proper contingencies, market conditions should all be considered. And know how to compare estimates against design decisions. Does the structural system match the cost assumption? Are specialty systems properly accounted for? Does the envelope cost reflect the design complexity? And less emphasis on cost estimating methods and more on critical review. All right, the second PPD change is all about cost considerations in design. The old objective said evaluate cost considerations during the design process. The new objective says evaluate the project design based on cost considerations. It's a subtle shift, but instead of considering costs during design, you're now evaluating the design through the cost lens. Study how cost impacts design decisions, material selections and those cost implications, system selection and what's the budget impact, or building configuration on cost and efficiency. And even site design and development costs. So make sure you understand value engineering principles, which is a game of reducing costs without sacrificing function. Understand cost-effective alternatives, where to spend and where to save, and how to make design modifications so it satisfies your budget. So make sure you know how to evaluate the design alternatives based on costs, like between your structural systems, envelope systems, or even MEP system costs. Now let's zoom out and talk big picture PPD. Both of these changes reinforce that architects need to constantly evaluate their design decisions through the cost lens and review cost information prepared by others. And I support that 100%. Architects are not construction cost experts, contracts are. So why are we in charge of making the construction cost estimates? This parallels a lot with the PA change and reinforces the shift architects as reviewers of cost information rather than the primary cost estimators. If you're studying PPD, focus on developing your cost evaluation and value engineering skills.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, your guide to passing the ARE.
All right, next up is project development documentation. And guys, there were no changes here. Zip, zero, nothing. Project development documentation is a perfect exam. It went completely untouched. So if you're studying for PDD right now, I don't think any of this applies to you. But maybe while we're here, I could just tell you real quick that we have about 1 hour of video content left to call our PDD 101 course completely complete on the Young Architect Academy. It includes over 15 hours of video content breaking down every single PDD objective and currently has over 435 PDD-specific practice questions. All of the finished content is currently available, and a bunch of our ARE boot campers and 101 students have used this course and passed PDD. I haven't gotten around to making a web page for this course yet because I got distracted with making this podcast. But it's still available through our AIA 101 course membership. Just visit academy.youngarchitect.com. Anyways, let's move on. All right, the last exam that got changed was construction evaluation. Construction evaluation only has one objective changing, so this is quick, but it's about the architect's role during bidding. The old objective covered all pre-construction activities based on delivery method, and that's really broad. The new objective narrows this to specifically the bidding process and your role in advising the client. The new objective narrows this to specifically the bidding process and your role in advising your client. So you're focusing on the bidding phase activity instead of trying to cover everything under the sun before construction starts. Make sure you master the bidding phase. That means preparing and issuing bidding documents, handling pre-bid meetings and site visits, responding to bidders' questions during bidding, bid evaluation and analysis, contractor selection assistance, and reviewing bids for completeness and accuracy. Understand your advisory role to the owner. You're helping evaluate contractor qualifications, explaining bid results and variations, recommending contractor selection, clarifying scope questions, and even advising on bid alternates. Also understand how the project delivery method changes with the bidding process. Design bid build has traditional competitive bidding, whereas design build has a different architect role. CM at risk might be more negotiated versus a bid. And IPD doesn't follow any traditional bidding policies. They kind of decide what's happening. So the good news is I did an amazing podcast all about public bidding of construction projects. This is a topic that I used to be obsessed with when I worked for the government as a project manager. So make sure you check out episode 015, Construction Bidding Process, Navigating Public Projects. So to zoom out, let's look at the big picture of CE. Guys, this change is about scope reduction. It makes the objective more focused and practical. Instead of all these pre-construction activities, you're now zeroing in on bidding. I'd say there's a pretty low level of concern here. This is one objective getting more focused, but to play it safe, I would still make sure you understand pre-construction in general. And that's everything, my friends. So look, 12 objectives changed across 5 exams. Most are clarifications of narrowing of focus, nothing too crazy. If you're studying right now, I'd say don't panic. NCARB repeatedly keeps saying your AIA study materials are still good. Just pay attention to these shifts. Now, let me tell you how I think these changes are going to impact your studying. If you're using NCARB's objectives as a roadmap and making sure you cover all your bases, you're going to be fine. These changes just give you a little more clarity on where to shift your focus. But if you're blindly following some AIA prep company without ever looking at NCARB's objectives yourself, then honestly, these changes are the least of your concerns. The AIA isn't testing how many hours you sat on the couch watching AIA prep videos. The AIA is asking you specific questions about how well you understand NCARB's objectives. And look, you're the one that has to take this test, not some AIA prep company. Not me, it's you. And the sooner you make understanding each objective your responsibility, the better off you're going to be. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this stuff super interesting, and I don't know why NCARB didn't use their webinar as an opportunity to actually talk about these changes in detail, but I had a lot of fun doing this analysis and going through these objectives, so I hope this was helpful for you. If you want all the details and objective numbers and links to all the free podcasts I mentioned, we even put together a 2-page PDF with a summary of all these objective changes. Go check out the full blog post at youngarchitect.com/AIA update. Listen, guys, you got this. These changes aren't really a big deal. Just keep studying hard, get the work done, and stay persistent. Do that, I'll guarantee you'll get to that finish line faster than you think. Oh, and also remember to come back to youngarchitect.com on November 18th for our Black Friday sale. It's going to be the biggest one we've ever had, and everything's going to be gone on December 2nd. I'm Michael Rosica, and I'll see you on the next podcast. Adios.
Thanks for listening to the Architect Exam Podcast. Ready to take your studying to the next level? Visit our online ARE Architecture School website at academy.youngarchitect.com to learn more about how we can help you. See you next time.